Ohayou gozaimasu. Osashiburi. Okay, that's the extent of my Japanese. But good morning and welcome back, and long time no see. Absolutely. As you may or may not remember, 2 weeks ago, from my house, I spoke about this old gatha, When We See the Golden Sun. In fact, it's so old that it's no longer included in the service book. It was deleted. But nonetheless, I chose to discuss this gatha 2 weeks ago because, let me take my mask off. Because of the kind of upbeat message that I think it had, which to me seemed very timely. Given the good news that we've been hearing lately, well, at least locally, that we seem to be finally emerging from the worst of the pandemic. And I was thinking that for this reopening service, the message of this gatha, When We See the Golden Sun, is still timely, maybe even more timely, since the temple has finally reopened. And so I think that discussing this gatha is a good way of reflecting on the significance of our reopening. And of course, today I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the lyrics of this gatha. But let me begin with an overview of what I think is the real significance of this gatha. So let me bring the lyrics up. Let's see. So the first verse of this gatha says, "When we see the golden sun shining from above, we are mindful of the Buddha's love. O'er us all a pure compassion sheds its steadfast glow. Through the Dharma, wisdom's way will show." And in my talk a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that, of course, the golden sun that's mentioned in the first line is, of course, a metaphor for the Buddha's love or the Buddha's compassion. And that the Buddha referred to in this gatha could either be Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, or Amida Buddha. But actually, thinking about it more, I don't think it really matters which Buddha is referred to by the composer A.R. Zorn. And this is because I think the song is ultimately referring to the working of the Dharma in our lives. And this theme of the working of the Dharma in our lives is actually the genesis of the original Living Dharma website of West Covina Buddhist Temple that I managed from 1997 to 2014. Now, here's a screenshot of that website's homepage. You can't read it, but let me read there. And right below the blue website title where it says The Living Dharma, there's a little paragraph of text that says, "Dharma refers to the teachings of Buddhism, the essence of which is the impermanent and interdependent nature of all life. But Dharma also refers to the everyday experiences of our lives that make these teachings come alive. That's why we say the Dharma is living. Ultimately, the living Dharma is about the compassion that naturally arises in us when we reflect deeply on what it means to be a human being." This passage, I think, expressed the vision or the raison d'etre, if you will, of the Living Dharma website itself. And I think this same vision, which essentially describes how the Dharma, how the teachings of Buddhism work in our lives, is captured in the first verse of When We See the Golden Sun. So the first verse, as I read earlier, ends with this line, "Through the Dharma, wisdom's way will show." Through the Dharma, wisdom's way will show. And I think this line is particularly significant because it confirms that, yes, it's the working of the Dharma in our everyday lives that shows us the way to the wisdom of the Buddha's teachings. So, for example, all of us can intellectually understand the Buddha's teaching of impermanence. Whether you're, even if you're a young child, you've experienced some kind of loss, maybe of a pet or a grandparent. Everyone can understand intellectually the teaching of impermanence, but it's actually our personal encounters with impermanence, with difficulty and loss, that we say in Buddhism are the necessary teacher that works to break down the hard shell of our ego, and then which opens us up to the awareness of the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life, to the essential oneness of all life. And actually, going on to Mr. Zorn's second verse, I think the second verse is equally brilliant, but in a different but related way. The second verse says, "When we see the silver moon gleaming bright and clear, we remember still that Buddha's near. Through his teachings here to guide us through this earthly night, out of sorrow into joy and light." And so here, the silver moon gleaming bright and clear is, of course, also a metaphor for the Buddha. But here, the gleaming silver moon is, I would say, reassuring us that even in the darkest night, the light of the Buddha's wisdom is always near. So, as I mentioned in my talk 2 weeks ago, I think that this image of the moon, gleaming in the night sky is particularly timely. The darkness of night, I think, is itself a metaphor for the dark times, for all sorts of suffering and difficulty, including, of course, the past 15 months of lockdown. But that, even in this darkness, the moon is the light that reminds us the Buddha Dharma is near. And so, yes, of course, the Buddha's teachings of impermanence and interdependence can indeed guide us through this earthly night, through the 15 months of lockdown, through the experience of great sorrow, great sacrifice, and great loss, into joy and light. But then, what exactly, is this joy and light? So, as I said in my earlier talk, it's certainly not. It certainly does not mean that all of our difficulties are resolved and that everything is going to be our way from now on. Like the song, "Happy Days Are Here Again." It's not. That's not what that line means. Actually, that would be, I think, as we could all agree, that would be rather unrealistic. And in Buddhism, we would say that would be rather dualistic. So in Buddhism, joy and light means, I think, seeing all the difficulties that we always see and will continue to see, but seeing them informed with the Buddha's wisdom. Or to put it another way, it's the radical insight that our happiness, or our true happiness, is not dependent on everything always going our way. So this goes beyond a mere sort of acceptance of reality to a deeper appreciation of our lives and the lives of others that our own life is interconnected with. Before I conclude my talk, I wanted to add a kind of Jodo Shinshu interpretation of Mr. Zorn's lyrics. So there are, according to some scholars, there are 3 key aspects of Shinran's teaching. And so the first one is, I think, apparent in the first line, or in the last line of this gatha, where the gatha says, it's out of sorrow, out of that earthly night, that we then naturally receive joy and light. I think this touches on a key aspect of Shinran's teaching, which is his emphasis on what we would call, in Japanese it's tariki, we could say other power, or power beyond the self. And I think the contemporary relevance of this is that the coronavirus and the 15 months of lockdown, of course, represent this tariki, this awesome power of impermanence. And then, like Shinran, our heads are, we would say, our heads are made to bow. Our heads are made to bow by the working of the Dharma. We are humbled by the power of the coronavirus. We realize we're not as in control of our lives as we thought we were. Life is unpredictable. Another related point about Shinran's teaching is that, so not only did he possess an unsparing, deeply, deep and profound, humble self-awareness, he linked the Buddhist awakening itself not to the mastering of difficult monastic practices like asceticism and celibacy, but simply to the receiving of this same humble self-awareness. And I think this is the deeper significance of the earthly night that Mr. Zorn mentions. It's not just the 15 months of lockdown. It's not just the devastating loss and the disruption of so many lives. Looking internally, looking within, it's also the negative mind states that we, or I should actually say, that I myself fell into. So in no particular chronological order through the last 15 months, I would say there were experiences of fear, experiences of anger. There was a lot of judgmental blame placing and finger pointing at others. There was, of course, isolation. There was depression. There was monkuing, or complaining. A lot of that, and lots of impatience. And in general, there was this whole question of, why me? which I think of as kind of like, I call it the Queen Vaidehi syndrome, for those of you that know the Meditation Sutra. Why me? Why did this have to happen to me? Okay, these are just some of the negative mind states that I'm aware of. I think if you ask my wife, she could list a lot more of mine. She would be happy to, actually, also. And then there's one other aspect of the 15 months of lockdown that I think resonates with Shinran's teaching. It's also reflected in Mr. Zorn's lyrics, and especially that second verse that I talked about. In the history of Buddhism, like Shakyamuni Buddha, Shinran's teaching was extremely socially radical. Because of his deep awareness of this absolute and universal power of the Dharma, of impermanence and interdependence, Shinran did not create a religious institution around himself. Yes, his later followers certainly did, which led to the huge institutions known today as Nishi and Higashi Honganji. But Shinran, in his lifetime, only referred to himself and his followers as all simply being ondobo, or equal fellow travelers on the path to awakening. And so if we understand that this same absolute and universal power of the Dharma, of impermanence and interdependence, has manifested in our contemporary lives in the form of the coronavirus pandemic, then all of us, whether or not we are aware of it, are universally affected by it in one way or another. And therefore, through these 15 months, I would ask you, haven't we all also come to a deeper appreciation of each other, that we are all truly in this together? And actually, I think Buddhism would say that those who do not think that they've suffered are actually suffering from a different kind of illness, which in Buddhism is the illness of having the illusion of being a separate, independent self. But yes, as we know, there's been so much suffering and difficulty. There's been so much loss. And yet at the same time, there's also this sense of us having collectively come out of that earthly night and now having a deeper appreciation of the many things that we'd previously taken for granted. And so I think, or I hope that I speak for all of us in saying that we're all so happy, so joyful to have our temple reopen and to be able to safely welcome our temple friends back, all of you back. In the words of the Living Dharma website, ultimately, the living Dharma is about the compassion that naturally arises in us when we reflect deeply on what it means to be a human being. And so now I'd like to play for you the Gatha, When We See the Golden Sun.
When we see the golden sun shining from above, we are
helping me put together that gatha. And thank all of you for listening today, and thank you, and welcome back to Higashi Honganji. Thank you very much. Naomi Dubs, Naomi Dubs, Naomi Dubs.